In this video, we will look at how we align Bloom's taxonomy verb and an objective to an assessment. This presentation is going to provide an overview of each of the levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Then we are going to dig a little deeper past the level to talk about how we match the verb we chose for that level to an appropriate assessment. You will see the image over here on the right, which walks us through the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. There are a lot of variations in what they call each one of these, but we are going to walk through this version. The first one is your base level, which is, remember, a lesson level objective. These level 1 Bloom's verbs are not module objectives or capstone objectives. Really, when you are remembering something, you are just recalling it. When we are using Bloom's taxonomy at this level, we are just asking them to recall a fact. For example, I give you a word. I asked you for a definition. I give you a definition. I get the word that matches the definition. It really is just about recall. The other thing is it could be about simply recognizing information. If I want them to recognize different visual aspects of something like a skill, in cybersecurity, perhaps I run a scan. The scan shows me that the codes don't match. So I am recognizing the fact that because the codes do not match, there is an issue and we need to dig further. That is a look at what a technical example looks like. So it is not only recall, but it could also be recognizing that I just told you if these two things don't match, then you need to dig into it because we have got a cyber attack. It is recognizing that in the actual presented output visual, so sometimes wires can get crossed at this beginner level with recognizing information. The definition that I really like for this level is exhibiting memory of previously learned material by recalling facts, terms, basic concepts, and answers. Now let's take a look at a couple of verbs and how we can align them to an assessment. I picked the ones that I think are the most popular and that people use the most so that we can match them. The first verb would be define if my objective starts with the word define. I could be matching the term to the definition. Now keep in mind that is not a matching question type because matching question types are often inaccessible. That could be I give you the definition and you identify the word in multiple choice. That could be I give you the definition. You identify the word by marking the words or dragging the word. I could give you the definition as a clue, and that could be a clue in a crossword puzzle. Then the actual input into the crossword would be the word that matches the definition. Of course, we can always give multiple choice where the learner is going to identify the correct term for the given definition. The key here is really that it's just recalling the definition. So we're recalling the definition or we are recalling the word that is given. By that definition, describe is one that I see used very often, and depending on the goal of your project and the assessment strategy, it can be very difficult to use because descriptions are often required to have synchronous grading. So if I want to describe as an objective, it can be very difficult to utilize this in an asynchronous environment, and that's why typically we have extended response essays. We could have a reflection, but a reflection would not be graded. Because of this, it is tricky if we are asking the learner to describe something. We could use a what do you think, where we are giving them some of the qualifications, but we are not really able to give that detailed specific feedback on the description. There is some sacrifice when you choose to describe your objective. The best way to do it asynchronously would be where I'm giving you a scenario, and then the answer choices are descriptions of what the scenario describes. Maybe it's the step in a process, or maybe it's I give you the step and you choose the correct description for the step. You can get there with multiple choice, but it's going to take a good bit of effort to get that where it needs to be. Label is one that I think is often underutilized. When we're doing labels, we can do a hotspot quiz question. So we can actually say, here's a diagram or a UX dashboard. Select the area of the dashboard that meets this characteristic. That could be a hotspot quiz question, which is developed in the storyline. We could have multiple choice where I give a diagram in the image and the multiple choice and I've got an icon that says, label this portion to match the right characteristic or to match the right component. That could actually be done within multiple choice. Then we also have drag and drops. Drag and drops can also have an image background, and we can actually create drop zones on top of an image so that they can drag it into that drop zone. It is a little more complex in H5P, but it's still possible. Sometimes we just forget. List is a great level 1 verb. If I'm teaching students a step in a process, or if I'm teaching students something to do with examples of quantitative and qualitative variables, it can be very helpful. For a list, we would typically use a fill-in-the-blank, but that can be tricky as well with asynchronous grading because you would have to consider every variation of it. We could also use prioritization in the list, so we could ask them and say, put the steps in order, and that would be prioritizing the list. We could also ask them multiple choice where they select the answer choice. That's the correct list of things. So maybe I list 5 variables for list quantitative and qualitative variables, and I give each answer. The choices have a couple of them listed, and the learner is selecting the correct list. So that's kind of the tweak we use whenever we're trying to get that asynchronous grading, is making sure the answer choice has a list and there's one singular correct answer. The most common verb by far that I see in level 1 is identify. That is a verb that a lot of people use, and so the key to identifying is recognizing that information from that first slide. For a drag and drop, we are dropping into a category that identifies something. So when I want to identify quantitative variables, I need a way where I'm asking them to basically identify it from a list. Crossword puzzles are another way you can identify the clue. You can give the description, and they can identify the item that matches the description. You can mark the words where they're identifying the characteristic or the concept that you're working with. You can drag the words as well in H5P. And then in the multiple choice, we can give them a very simple scenario that doesn't deviate much from the lesson content where the learner is going to identify in multiple choice what that is. So maybe we give them a description of step 3 in a process and we say, which step does this match? We have got step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and they choose the correct step. Then they identify the step that matches the question. Now level 2 is understand, which is also at the lesson level and should not be confused with the fact that we don't use understand as a measurable verb. The reason we don't use understand as a measurable verb is because understanding is defined by a list of possible verbs that we can use to evaluate understanding. I can't measure understanding itself, but I can measure things that would lead me to believe the learner understands. In this level, we are going to explain key concepts so we are no longer recalling them. We're adding a little bit of our own thoughts and explanations here. We could give a high-level overview with the main ideas, and we're just looking for a simple explanation, not applying it to new situation. Still keeping it really close to the content in the lesson, so we can have them summarize core points, and that's a really good way to look at the lesson-level objectives. If you're looking for something that kind of neatly wraps up a lesson, summarizing the core points can be a great way to do that. So if we dig into level 2, what we're really trying to do is have the learner demonstrate understanding of facts or ideas by organizing them, comparing them, interpreting them, giving a description, or stating the main idea. So these are the ways that we ask them to demonstrate understanding by using these methods. So every time you think of an objective verb, the assessment still has to align to organizing, comparing interpreting descriptions, and mean ideas. First, let's look at the verb associate. If I want someone to associate things, they could match items that are related to one another. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean a matching question because those aren't accessible in most interfaces. But it could be that I give you a multiple choice question and I'm asking you which one of these is related to this idea. Mark the words in H5P is fantastic for associations. So we fill in the blanks and drag the word activities because I'm able to say which of these associates with this concept, and they can drag the words over. They can type it and fill in the blank, or they can mark the word that's the correct association. When you're thinking of association, I kind of think back to these types of questions that you see a lot in your K-12 assessments. You'll see things such as red is to blue like green is to what? Here you would think about how they are associated. They are both primary colors, so what happens with green? What would green be associated with from there? Classify is a really good verb because when we're classifying things, it's like we're grouping information and organizing it within our own brains. Classify is a verb that I think is really underused because when we ask a learner to classify information, it's actually organizing it and their file cabinet within their own brain, and it's a great retention strategy. I like to use the verb classify whenever I can because not only are you assessing the learner, but you're also giving them an extra tool in their toolkit to master the material in the lesson. Drag and drops are excellent for these because your drop zone is a classification, and you're moving items into the correct classifications. You can do this in multiple choice as well. The same is true with mark the words. If I were to classify the steps in a cybersecurity process, I could just have them mark Step 1, Step 2, Step 3, or Step 4 based on the description that they were given. You can also use memory cards where you're matching cards to things in storyline, and 85P, and you can use image choice. Image choice is one that I really like for classification because, again, not only are you creating this organizational structure in their brain, but now you're giving them a visual to tie to that organizational structure, and cognitive research shows us that that's really powerful as a tool for actually understanding material. So image choice is an excellent way to do classifications, and we use a lot of icons for that. An icon that looks like the item that you're classifying really helps out when you're comparing and contrasting things. I do like to see that broken out into two objectives. Having one verb at a time is really nice, but comparing or contrasting can be done in a reflection. The ideal upper-level assessment would be a reflection, but learners can't always get feedback when we're doing things that way. If they're not able to fully give feedback, then a reflection might not be a good fit for that project. I can also use multiple choice where answers highlight what's similar or different between these concepts. Mashing is not a question type as much, but something like image choice or memory cards where I'm matching the concepts together by their characteristics can work well. Discuss is a verb that I see used very often, and I don't recommend using it if you don't have teacher feedback because discuss is going to require talking to a peer and doing a reflection. Discuss is a two-part verb. When I'm discussing something, I will give my interpretation and explanation, but then I will discuss that with someone else. If you don't have the ability to have a discussion forum or peer reviews, discuss is not possible because discussions are explaining your position and then discussing that with the context of someone else's position. Because of this, discussion doesn't have a place in asynchronous environments. Distinguish is one of my favorites and is a twist on compare and contrast and classify because it's like one half step up. When I want students to distinguish something, I'm asking them to group things or classify things by characteristics, and then they're distinguishing between those characteristics. These often can be written to be harder or easier, but depending on how obvious the characteristic you're distinguishing between them is, you can use mark the words or drag the words. Memory cards are excellent, and so is image choice. Again, image choice is really powerful as a cognitive tool because instead of just saying distinguish between the 5 steps in supply chain management with 5 different icons, if I just had step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5 as a multiple choice, it's not as memorable. If I give them the step with an icon for the step, I'm then creating better recall for the learner because they're going to see that icon in their head and they're going to associate that icon better with the step because it should be representative of what the step shows. So image choices, again, really, really powerful with distinguishing. Now we start moving up from our lesson level, and we're kind of in that higher level of application. These could be lesson level or module level. We are moving out of the lesson and into the overarching modules. When looking at apply, we're looking specifically at apply the concept to a new context. That means the new context should not be in the lesson, and it's not in the content that you wrote. We are having to come up with new situations for learners to react to. I'm going to present something, and I'm going to have them react to it based on what they learned in the lesson. I can also have them implement ideas and practice. Instead of just recalling what a theory says or looking at the different pieces of a theory, I want them to be able to actually implement it in a hands-on activity. At this level, we're really looking for learners to solve problems to new situations of something that's not in the lesson, but is typically parallel to something you presented in the lesson. We want to make sure they have the tools to do the actual question by applying acquired knowledge, facts, techniques, and rules in a slightly different way. Essentially, it's just asking them to do some independent thinking. The most common verb here is always apply. If I'm applying something, I can give them a branching scenario because in the branching scenario, I'm presenting a new context and asking them to apply what they learned to a new context. You can also use multiple choice questions that are scenario-based, such as a scenario that you didn't see in your lesson, but is similar to something in your lesson. What would you do? How would you apply this theory to this scenario? Crossword puzzles can actually be used to do this also. I can give them a new scenario example of a concept, and then the answer would be the concept. So in that instance, I'm having them think about the concept in a different context. Story-based assessments like case studies with multiple choice questions are an excellent way to get them to apply what they learned to a new context and situation. Now, this is often going to take multiple questions, so you can't have just one question to assess applied because we're now at a higher level of blooms. I need to ask you several different times with several new contexts for me to know that you can apply what you've learned truly. It's really important to have multiple questions with new scenarios and new contexts so that you understand how well they can apply it. Develop is a very common verb at this level, and you need to understand that develop is a multi-step objective. I have to get the learner to make decisions. So branching scenarios are great for multiple choice questions that are scenario-based and that they're picking something that could, after maybe 5 questions, actually have developed a plan based on 5 decisions they made. What's really key in development is that you show them what they developed. So for instance, if I'm asking them to develop some type of plan for cybersecurity, and I'm giving them a prompt such as someone has breached, what do you do first? After they answer that it says you've identified the type of breach, what do you do next? They're making multiple decisions, and at the end, you say you have now developed a plan to protect your business from the decisions that you made. In paragraph format or bullet points, you can explain those decisions that were made and how they formulated the plan. With develop, there's an extra burden put on the assessment writer to make sure that there's a way that they can bring it all together. If you just ask someone to make decisions that are not developed, that's going to be arguable at different levels. If I'm developing something, I should make several decisions and choices. But then I need to see what I develop. So if there's no final product, you did not hit develop. Interpret is asking them to look at new contexts and new ideas, which is the whole purpose of this level of blooms. That could be scenario-based multiple choice questions. That could be a case study where the multiple choice questions ask the learner to interpret something based on the context they're given in the case study reflections. Essay responses are good for this, but again, if we're asynchronous, those are not as good of an option because especially at this level of blooms, a reflection can be very complex. Giving them that feedback and the accordion piece can be difficult to interpret because it's very nuanced. With non-teacher graded stuff, I would not typically use a reflection or an essay. Determine is an excellent one because in determine, it's kind of a parallel to apply. So in determining here's a new situation, determine what should happen. Should we scan our systems because there's an intruder since these numbers don't match in the initial scan or something is flagged? So what's the next course of action? The way to do these would be multiple choice questions that are scenario-based, where the learner is choosing an action. When you are determining you are reacting to something, you wouldn't say determine which step of the cybersecurity process is described because that's identified. That's not at the apply level. When we're talking about determine, it's very much a reaction to, and it's within a new context. If you want to determine the step, that's really incorrect because it would identify the step because you're just doing that recall level. So separate that as you think about this. Then there's explain, which is like describe. I don't recommend using explain if you don't have teacher-graded stuff because with a reflection, again, you're not getting synchronous feedback. That explanation could have wrong components that you don't think of in that accordion that we write. The only workaround for explaining could be to give a learner a scenario, and then the actual multiple choice answers are explanations. Now, this can be difficult with cognitive load because of all of your multiple choice is explanations. That's a lot for the learner to read and process. Again, I avoid explain whenever possible simply because it's very difficult to assess, and now we're starting to reach the top end. Analyze is really something we would expect to see at a module level or even at a capstone level depending on the course and what the course calls for and analyze. We're evaluating relationships, so we're determining how ideas connect to one another. So really we're forming connections, and we want to take the overarching concept and break it out into parts. In analyze, every objective should be taking this larger idea and breaking it down into smaller parts. If you think about what I've done up until this point saying this is a lesson objective, the breaking it down into those parts is also related to those Bloom's 1 and 2 objectives. Sometimes to get to a higher level objective, we have to have those components early on. We're really going to look at examining and breaking information into parts, and we're going to identify motives or causes. We're going to make inferences based on those parts, and you want to find evidence that supports generalizations. Now let's look at the verb analyze. Branching scenarios are great, but when you branch a scenario, you have to break it down into parts for the learner to analyze. So this could be there were 10 different actions that happened, and we want to analyze each action that happened in this one case study that's breaking it down. Multiple choice questions could break down a case study into smaller bite-sized pieces, and we could analyze if the appropriate thing was done for each component. This will take several questions to get to because I need to take the concept, break it into all its components, and then have the learner analyze all of those components. That is going to take multiple questions and multiple ways of looking at this. Categorize is often confused with the lower-level Bloom's classify categorizing because we are in the analyze section. We're looking at the components of a concept. So that's what we're categorizing as the components. It's not as simple as height is a quantitative variable because it's a number that's a classification. I'm looking at the big picture and the components that lead to it. I could say if I want to do descriptive statistics for a mean, the mean requires that all variables be numbers. Then I could say categorize which of the following measurements would give us a mean, and they would be able to move it. So that's categorizing and not classifying. There's also a context that's new and not something that's directly in the lesson. They are having to take what they know about descriptive statistics and the mean, so they know that it has to be number-based, and then they're having to categorize which measurements would meet that criteria so that I could do that upper-level descriptive statistic. Drag and drop are great for this. Multiple choice questions, again, are always possible. But it will take multiple questions to ensure that you've covered all the ways this concept could be broken down, or at least the main points. Differentiate is a great one, not to be confused with compare and contrast. When we're doing differentiation at the level of Bloom's, we're differentiating between components and a process. Examples of this are very nuanced. If I'm differentiating between two things that are similar, I'm really wanting them to identify what are those couple of anomalies that make it different. Multiple choice questions that are scenario-based that has the learner differentiate between the components of something would work. If I'm looking at differentiate between the mean and the median, well, I'm going to break it down. The mean and the median both use numbers, so I can't use that as a differentiation factor. And the mean is impacted by outliers or numbers that seem out of place. but the median is not impacted. So if I want them to differentiate between mean and median, I need to pull out that characteristic that differs between the two of them, which is really about outliers. I'm now going to craft this into a question. So a researcher is trying to calculate the middle of income for all Americans, but wants to make sure that it's not impacted by outliers of either very high income or very low income. Which statistic would be the best one, the mean or the median? I pulled out that idea of outliers by talking about very high and very low income, and that's where we differentiate and say it would be the median. So really, differentiation is nuanced, and it's about a component that we're not going to say in the question directly. Now looking at evaluations, you're going to be evaluating each decision or action taken by someone. Evaluations are often branching scenarios built in storyline where we're evaluating each step in the scenario, and we're looking at based on the step in the scenario. What's your evaluation of it? Was it the right action? Was it not the right action? That breaks a concept down into a series of actions or plans that were executed. Within that, it allows the learner to give their evaluation. Now, these can also be done in cleverly done multiple choice questions that are scenario-based, and we're going to ask the learner to evaluate it. But we're not going to be able to get quite as good if we don't really craft that question, right? So in the answer choices, we've got to give them a strong evaluation. I can't just say they were correct. I need to say this action was the most appropriate because it was blank. We're asking the learner to differentiate between very descriptive answer choices. Should we try to do this with multiple choice? Case studies are another great one. I'm giving you a case study. I want you to evaluate how the business within the case study handled a breach of confidentiality for customer data. So again, I'm able to look at the whole scenario, everything the company did, and then I'm going to evaluate what they did. Now this will take multiple questions to accomplish, and it's also going to be something that you could also order actions by priority. If you want to evaluate what steps a company should take after the breach, maybe you would continue the case study. You could also use prioritization to say what steps they should have done and what order if it wasn't the best choice or moving on. What should they do in what order? So that's kind of a little add-on I'm tagging here that takes it up to that next level. Prioritization is not used often enough. When we ask learners to prioritize decisions and actions, we dig into mastery here. This is a great objective because it will pull so heavily into mastery. After all, learners are going to have to stop and think about every aspect of it. So a branching scenario is a great example of doing this. Multiple choice can be done with having the actions in a specific order. Still again, cognitive load is really hard. So if you have 6 items, they're prioritizing. Then every answer choice has a list of 6 items in a different order. At that point, we're not assessing the concept. We're assessing how well they can handle the extreme cognitive load. So, prioritization. The best way to prioritize would be to order items to use drop-down numbers for what's first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on and so forth. Last, we have to evaluate, which will be at the module or capstone level. So we're assessing if a decision was good or if it was the best decision. Then we evaluate the merit of that idea. So at this level, we present and defend opinions by making judgments about information, ideas, or the quality of work based on set criteria. Now, your lesson must have the criteria in there. Explain the criteria, and give an example of using the criteria. Otherwise, you have not provided the appropriate scaffolding for the evaluation. So this is where sometimes the verb drives the content in some ways if we want to take them to this objective. We've got to make sure that infrastructure is there leading up to it. First, we have assess, and assessing is pretty easy. We're going to rank actions or order them and how they should be done, or we're going to question and say whether the right decisions were made. A reflection is one way to do it. But I wouldn't use a reflection alone because you need them to get feedback on their assessment so they can understand it. Simulations are phenomenal for assess. If I want a learner to be able to complete an inferential statistics test, Or if I want them to assess a data set, I'm going to have them get into Excel and do things with it. So simulations and branching scenarios where actions are rated or assessed from different choices are great. Here, the verb decide should not be confused with the verb determine because here I'm looking for the learner to choose the decision. This is a true branching or simulation situation. They can prioritize and order sentences in H5P to help rank their decisions. They can use multiple choice questions where we ask the learner to decide based on context or output. So again, if I want to do simulations, I could say determine if school A or school B has a statistically significant difference. In order to determine that, I have to run a test in Excel. When you're using decide, it can be very driven by the technology in the field that it's in. So if we're in cybersecurity, and we're trying to decide on the appropriate measures to be taken based on a cyber attack, we're going to need to see that simulation to know exactly what was done, what data we have, what scans have been run, and what they show us. Decide is going to be kind of a mini capstone experience because of that. Justify is a verb that I see used inappropriately at lower levels of Bloom's. Justify is meant to be at this upper level, and it's meant to justify that an action was the correct action or a statement as the most correct. Reflections can be good for the learner to organize their thoughts, but it should never stand alone with justification. Sometimes you might give a learner reflection and give a statement and say, justify the statement. And that helps them organize the information within their minds. I would also want to take them into a branching scenario or a simulation where the output justifies why this output isn't right. If I'm looking at a scan, I can point to this particular number, and this particular number tells me. That justification can be really powerful in branching or simulations. Case studies, again, justifications are also related to case studies. All of levels 4 or 5 and 6 are going to pull heavily from case studies because you're wanting to give them a new context, and then you're wanting them to apply, assess, or evaluate based on this new context. With those case studies, we can have multiple choice questions that follow up with potential justifications offered. And we would ask the learner which justification is correct based on what you saw in the lesson. This has to be very intentionally done. You have to be careful with these assessments because we want them to understand justification, which will take several different questions, and especially when we don't have that synchronous feedback, it's going to take several questions trying to dig down into those justifications. A lot of people confuse select with identify because they feel like it's as simple as you just pick here. We're not selecting or identifying something we are talking about. Again, we are talking about the opinion. Is it correct or is it not correct? So when we say select here, we're selecting a course of action. We're selecting which plan is the most appropriate. We're selecting which UX dashboard is the best for display in these characteristics. We're asking them for a much higher order and not just saying select the quantitative variable. We're saying, here's the new context. Select which plan, select the course of action, select what we should do next. You can also utilize prioritization for select here. So we might have them select the order in which this company should react to a cybersecurity attack. That is still select, but we're selecting the order in which things happen. Ranking is also a great one too, where you're ranking which actions are priorities. If we're selecting the plan, there has to be a reason we're selecting one plan versus another. Having a multiple choice question that says select which plan as the most appropriate doesn't get to the hardest select. I will have to follow that up with why did you get there? What's your justification? Show me how you think the steps should go. So this is going to be, again, multiple questions. One of my favorites that I think is underutilized is summarize. Now summarize, of course, is a great one. When you have teacher feedback, it's not as great for asynchronous. I like to give reflections where the learner is summarizing what they learned or things like that. But that doesn't give the learner the feedback they need. So you would have to combine a reflection with something else. At that point, the reflection's just allowing the learner to gather their thoughts and their opinions and ideas. You could also have them choose multiple choice questions with which one has the best summary. But this overall is a pretty tough verb to assess without a graded synchronous experience, and we have to remember that when we're summarizing, we're not talking about recalling the information. That's not a summary. When we're talking about summarizing, we're talking about taking those components, highlighting them, and talking about the justifications. That's really a summary, not just recalling the facts in the lesson. When we're summarizing, we're hoping that they're operating at that higher level where they're looking at the components, what actions were taken, and if they were appropriate. Lastly, we have create. Create is mostly at the capstone level. Creation is a tough verb to get to in Bloom's taxonomy when we create something where we are brainstorming and developing original ideas, or a prototype. So when we compile information in different ways by combining the elements in a new pattern or proposing new solutions, that creates what really has to be assessed. In a high-level simulation, it is scaffolded with other simulations that led up to it because coming up with a new plan or idea is very hard in an asynchronous environment. So what are the verbs for a created construct? If I'm constructing a plan, or if I'm constructing a response to something, I'm ranking actions that can be done in H5P or in storyline. I can look at a case study and then think about the actions and decisions that were made in the case study and what should be done. Again, reflection can be used, but it wouldn't ever stand by itself. Branching can be used where actions are rated or assessed by different choices. If I'm constructing a framework for cybersecurity threats, I would need to have a low, medium, and high risk. Then I, as the learner, will have to decide what is a low risk for cyber attack. What is a medium risk? What is a high risk? I must create that framework based on what you told me in the lesson. We also have the verb create. This is very tough to do in the asynchronous environment, and it's going to require learners to have to make a series of decisions that, when combined together, create something new. If you want the learner to create a data analyst study where they're looking at UX interfaces, you will have to ask them a series of questions where they're looking at the interfaces. They're correlating that interface to what they learned in their lesson. All of those answers are brought together, and the learner is shown here based on the past couple of questions you answered. Here is what you created and created this plan. So that's kind of how we have to think about creating. Since we're not in a synchronous classroom, it could also be creating a prototype. In some of the storylines, you can drag items into place. So you can give them the components of a network and we can say, create a secure network using these components, and they can drag those components into place. They would have created a diagram that shows a secure network. So I know that you can go forward and create something. This is a tough one. A lot of times it involves not necessarily making the item intangible with your hands, but instead describing how you would create it. Design is exactly what create is. You're designing a plan, you're designing a prototype. So all of what I just said for create applies to design. Justify can be used at different levels when justify is used to create something new. So we're not having learners react to a new concept. We're having them create the plan. We're having them create what's going to happen. Then that justify is going to fall into this area. It's when they're justifying new combinations of information. Maybe there's an exception. Maybe we've got a new combination based on different type of attack. How can we make a better plan? How can we justify our actions? Lastly, there is plan. Plan is exactly what create and design are, because really at this level, everything goes back to the idea that you're creating something new, utilizing components, or combining information in new ways. That's a quick look at aligning the Bloom's taxonomy verbs to assessments. Hopefully you found that helpful, and hopefully it gives you some ideas of when to use the H5P, when to use storyline, and also the types of activities and what those verbs can bring out.